Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm thrilled to welcome you to this session entitled Intersectionality in the Endowment, DEI, and Racial Equity Investing. I am Hanako Boulanger, Program Director for Sustainable Investing, Climate Justice, and DEI. I'd like to take a minute for us to recognize the longstanding history that has brought us to reside on Indigenous lands and reflect on appreciating our place within that history. We've shared the link to our land acknowledgement page in the chat so you can learn more about our journey and the actions we are taking to meaningfully support Indigenous communities. With that in mind, I acknowledge that I'm joining you all today from Long Island City, which is the ancestral homelands of the Munsee Lenape and Canarsie people. To our audience members, you are also welcome to share with us the native land on which you reside. And if you don't know it, you may find it by using the native land map link we've shared with you in the chat. Beyond this land acknowledgement, I also encourage you all to commit to taking action to support Indigenous communities and return land to Indigenous people, such as donating your time or money and supporting Indigenous-led grassroots movements and campaigns. Thank you, and I'm going now to hand it over to Tamara Larson, our moderator and the co-chair investment committees at the David Rockefeller Fund. Tamara, to you. I'm sure she's going to join us. I'm sure our speakers are going to be back very shortly. We had them just before to start, so I'm just going to take a minute to see what's going on. I'm sure Tamara is going to be able to join. I'd like to thank you all for your patience as we are trying to bring everyone on stage. Tamara, I think you need to unmute yourself and you need to turn on your camera so everyone can hear you. And Dorian, we can now see you. Kunle, we can now see you. And there we go. We can see anyone. I'm going to disappear now. Okay, so what Tamara tries to...
Here we go. I'm so sorry. So I'm Tamara Larson. My apologies for the technological issues. I'm so happy to join our illustrious panel of guests here for our discussion on intersectionality and endowment portfolios, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and racial equity. We are going to have some 15 minutes at the back end for question and answer. But we really want to lead off with our discussion with our illustrious panelists. I have Kunle Apamba, Habib Modichiro, and Dorian Burton joining us today. We're going to give them a couple of minutes just to introduce themselves, and then we'll dive right into the discussion. Kunle, do you want to begin? Actually, it looks like Kunle has been opted out, is out. Habib, do you want to begin? Habib, we can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was having a monologue. So I was saying, thank you, Tamara. Thank you, the Intentional Endowment Network, for having us today. My name is Habib Mudashiru. I'm the co-founder and chief investment officer of V-Square Quantitative Management. And V-Square is an asset manager that we founded 2 years ago, and that has sustainability at its core. And as you can hear, I'm French. I've been living in the US for 17 years now. My accent always gives me away, and I'm really happy to be here to discuss with you. And I'm calling actually from Chicago, Illinois, but the actual land is Peoria, Oklahoma territories.
Kunle? Oh, we can't hear you. Okay, in the meantime, Dorian, why don't you jump in?
Hi, how you guys doing today? My name is Dorian Burton. I am the CEO and managing partner of the Southern Reconstruction Fund. We are a private foundation focused on bringing capital and restorative capital into the southeast part of the United States. We have an equity vehicle that we push forward that really is focused on capitalizing first-time fund managers of color. I'm super happy to be here with my colleagues, and thank you for the time.
Kunle, I don't know if your mic started connecting. We can't hear you. Okay, in the meantime, we'll keep going. Kunle, we'll keep working on that. Maybe we'll just dive in. As I said before, I'm Tamara Larson. I'm co-chair of the finance committee for the David Rockefeller Fund. I'm also a board and finance committee member for the Public Welfare Foundation, as well as the Clara Lionel Foundation. And all of them are really focused on exploring pathways to incorporate DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and racial equity lens investing into their philanthropic work, as well as their investment portfolios. I do want to acknowledge that I am joining from Denver, Colorado, which is the ancestral land of the Cheyenne people. So let's dive right in. Kunle will join as he can. There is a lot of talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion and racial equity lens investing, and it can mean different things within different organizations. So that can contribute to variation in what the goals are, as well as the outcomes. How do you define diversity, equity, and inclusion investing in an endowment context? Dorian, why don't you lead off?
Absolutely. So as I think about...
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you, Kunle.
I'll let Kunle introduce herself.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dorian. I could hear everyone, but no one could hear me. Apologies for the delay. Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I'll make this brief. My name is Kunle Apampa. My role currently is head of client advisory and partnerships at Capricorn Investment Group, one of the largest mission-aligned investment groups globally. I'm working on building a mission-aligned outsourced CIO service for mission-driven investors. More broadly, I'm calling from New York City and the native land of the Canarsie people, as I've learned myself. But I'm happy to be here, and sorry to interrupt.
All right, so we were just diving in on how you all define DEI investing in an endowment context, and Dorian was going to lead off.
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't properly follow the prompt as well. I do know, while I didn't have a chance to look it up, I do know that we are on land that was stolen from indigenous people and built off the backs of Black people. So I'll start there. As I think about the work of DEI, I think about equity actually as our work, right? I think we live in a time where we put DEI in kind of a box and start to try to think about, we think about it as kind of almost an add-on to our core function or our core work. As I look at it from the Southern Reconstruction Fund and the work that we do in terms of being able to think about how do we deploy capital, it really is centered on equity as the core function of our work, not meaning that we have to pivot towards it. But how do we think about this day in and day out in ways that affect communities, affect individuals and the community specifically that we care about within the Southeast. And I'm talking very specifically about Black communities in this work. And so when the way that we think about it is very much so focused as this is our core work as we look out towards and how we place our investments.
Abib, do you want to jump in here?
Absolutely. There's not much I can add to what Dorian just said, but for me, diversity cannot just go without equity and inclusion. This is something usually, and with everything we've been seeing in our field, in the financial industry, for instance, companies are able to achieve diversity, and I can argue this is something that kind of easy to do today. But what's harder to do is the equity and inclusion part. On Wall Street, you have a lot of diversity when you look at the workforce, but the problem that we often see is that after when you leave the entry-level type of roles, and as you climb the ladder, the corporate ladder, all the way to the top, this is where you see less and less diversity, and this is why for us we cannot separate diversity from the equity part and the inclusion part.
Kunle?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think that's a great question to kick us off. I want to start my response in sort of a storytelling format. And prior to joining Capricorn, I'd spent over a decade at Goldman, tiny shop, most folks may know I've known about. But a brief history note here on more broadly what diversity means as we defined it there. It could vary on different layers, and a lot of times when clients came asking in terms of we want diversity in terms of whatever they were doing, whether it was an endowment or a foundation context, the question I often asked back to them was, at what level are you looking for DEI, right? Especially, I'm sure the folks, the expert panelists on this call can talk about the public market in depth. Speaking more on the private side, it's very easy to first look at it more from the GP ownership structure. Are you looking for diversity there for opportunities? Or is it the entire team of the fund manager that you're looking for diversity? And then even going further down, are you looking for diversity in the portfolio companies that they're investing in? So the founders, are they diverse? Or are you looking for diversity in the investments that they're making in the underlying goods and services that these companies are producing out there? So, you could define diversity through different lenses and you can look at it, but I think establishing your own view and establishing an idea of what you're looking to solve for gets you in a better platform or better outlook to be able to see or actually look for managers or opportunities out there that solve that specific problem with DEI that you're looking for.
You've all touched on this concept of diversity isn't necessarily the same thing as equity. So let's talk about considerations for racial equity in an endowment context and going beyond diverse managers, which is usually the area of focus. Habib, do you want to lead off?
Absolutely. What I can say in our field, which is public markets, public equity, public fixed income, you name it. Equity, the way we define equity is mostly as the fact that as you leave those entry level position when you are up for a promotion. Kunle mentioned that he was at Goldman. I'm a former JP Morgan as well. I know the tiny shop. When you're up for promotion, that the people who are making those decisions are generally come with are also a diverse group. This is why it becomes very complicated, because the promotion usually are decided by people, and people usually tend to flock with people, and you have, when there's no diversity, it's actually reflected when there's no diversity at the top, it's actually starts affecting the diversity at the workforce level, and most importantly, the equity part of it. And that's why the way we really tackle the problem is we believe that one of the solutions is really to start at the top, because this is where you really actually set the tone. And you also have then people who are decision maker. Not only people who are actually working for them can see themselves reflected at the board level or at the senior executive level, but also the people at those levels who are making decisions know that being a woman or being a person of color or being from another background is not necessarily an impediment to the performance that you can the contribution you can bring in your day-to-day job.
Dorian, what's your response to that?
Yeah, I would say, as we think about equity, particularly in the time of now, and things like the wake of George Floyd, you look at a lot of the conversations that were happening, a lot of the commitments that were made. So I think you probably had $50+ billion that was actually committed around kind of in terms of investment in communities of color and how equity was or is being kind of defined now. And I think you're having this conversation around racial equity without the conversation around actual capital and how that capital actually flows into communities, and who gets to deploy that capital. So Tamara, you said you talked about money managers of color, but also who gets to make the decisions around how that capital actually gets spent. And so you can't have the conversation around racial equity without the conversation around equity around capital. And believing that capital is a superior form of investment when you're talking about ownership, when you're talking about leveling the playing field, when you're talking about people's opportunity to actually be able to thrive in place. And I think as we look at pushing our endowments towards being more equitable, we have to think about how we look at capital and who has access to it, and to be able to define who has the opportunity to actually shape markets.
Kunle?
Yeah, it's often, and I think Dorian and Habib have done a great job in sort of setting the tone here. Diversity for me is more of involving people from sort of the different social, ethnic backgrounds, whether that be gender or sex. But equity, just like we know it in the public market, when you call something a public equity, it's ownership, right? It's value. It's like you have a skin in the game, you have a stake in what is being considered a decision-making opportunity. And so, I think from a racial equity standpoint, I think it refers, at least to me, from a condition where one's origin or racial or ethnic identity has no influence on the quality of life that they can eventually build. I think from an endowment standpoint, one thing that I do want to note, or I'd like to see in particular, is I'm super passionate about establishing sort of these financial literacy courses, right? Being able to teach, we all go to school to learn skills about things that we need to be able to get the job done, but no one really teaches you about how to manage money and financial successes. But I think when it comes to equity specifically, I think having an ownership stake, especially where you are in a particular company or in your community, gives you more of an empowerment rather than just using the word diversity, which just means sort of a population scan on how things are distributed more widely.
Yeah. My experience is that,
I'm sorry, I think one thing to add on to that, something we was just talking about is are we talking about, when we're having a conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, is it diversity for diversity's sake? Or do you actually fundamentally believe that having a more diverse staff, a more diverse team, making more diverse investments actually leads to a different set of value creation inside your organization and in terms of the returns that you're actually going to see? And so I think it's really important to look at it as, what is the value that we're creating throughout the organization by being more diverse, and the value that's created for us, not as, I think it tends to fall into this charity lens around, oh, we're going to invest in, or we're going to bring this person on because they're more diverse and we're doing them a favor, as opposed to we're actually creating value for our organization. And then so I think it's really important to define it in that way.
And that leads to this concept that we were talking about in our prep sessions for this, about potential intersections between philanthropy and endowment and racial equity investing. Sometimes people assume that if you're bringing on more diverse talent around the table, that that's going to necessarily translate into more mission alignment. So it'd be interesting to just talk about, historically there have been silos where the philanthropic team is over here and the endowment and investment team is over on the other side, and they're not necessarily talking. And mission alignment is certainly about trying to get more communication and minimize the dissonance between those two groups and how they interact with the market more broadly. But what are your thoughts about intersections between philanthropic work and endowment investing in the context of racial equity? Anyone want to jump in, or shall I call on the audience?
I can kick this off. I mean, it's a very tough question to ask, because especially for folks who don't work in sort of an endowment or foundation space, it's very hard to make an opinion without being on the ground. But I promise this is not a plug, but Capricorn also serves as CIO for our family group of the Skoll Foundation, and through that lens, I've been able to see both sides, mainly on the philanthropic grant making side as well as the investment making side. And Skoll recently just hired Marla Blow, who's a phenomenal executive and operator, and now is the president. But she brings a perspective that has completely changed the outlook of the foundation as a whole, right? Because she's not only thinking about things from the grant making philanthropic side, but she has that thought process of incorporating investment philosophies and investment guidelines around that. And I think that's something that we all try to do in terms of, from an investment side, is what are the goals of the endowment and what are the values and objectives from a long-term perspective that they're trying to achieve with the philanthropic work they're doing, and how do you take those same set of values and sort of overprint it on the investment side so that you're putting dollars to work and ticking the boxes on those similar objectives from a long-term perspective that have market rate return as well. And so I think having an alignment between what you want to do on the philanthropic side as well as what you wanted to do on the investment side helps with a lot of synergetic plays within the organization to be able to execute on things more from a concessionary perspective all the way through the lens to market rate return as well. And it helps you be a lot more nimble, it helps you be a lot more intentional, it helps you be a lot more targeted for what you're looking for, but it also gives you a definition, a brand, and an ethos that you can go by to be able to establish yourself as a leader in the industry.
I can certainly add to that. And Kule, I think you did a great job to kind of set up the table, because it's a very loaded question. If I really have to say it, to approach it from a very binary standpoint, I would have on the left side the philanthropic aspect of it. I would have on the right side the market investment aspect of it, where endowments, you want to invest in diverse candidates or in diverse firms, diverse managers to actually make money. Can they do it? We understand the philanthropic side, and there's when we started the firm B Square, we both of the founders, we had 20 years of experience working on the markets on Wall Street. But the first thing that we did was to write a CSR, a corporate social responsibility policy, because what we wanted to do, we wanted to have those themes really in the DNA of what we are doing. And so on the philanthropic side, you want to fight for social justice, to try to quell inequalities. This is good that we have foundations that are there, that have that missions, that are actually do that. But I think the better approach for them would be to empower those communities, to teach. Basically, I think proverbially people say to teach people how to fish, so they basically can do it themselves. And you have our side, which is the investment management community, and you have diverse managers out there, especially after the the murder of George Floyd 2 years ago. Dorian mentioned it. There was a lot of money committed to try to help those diverse managers that actually are also called emerging managers, although Sometimes I like to remember people that we have emerged 20 years ago. And so this is where we struggle with it as a company. I mean, everything's going well. We don't have to really complain. But what I'm saying is that the first few times that we actually met people that we thought were really willing to look seriously at emerging managers, seriously at diverse managers, to make decisions and to allocate and do a serious due diligence, if you will. We realized after many meetings that it was more an exercise of checking the box and keeping us or keeping all the others on the radar, rather than really a serious exercise of considering all the experience, everything that you can bring. And I think it's Dorian who mentioned it earlier. Most time when people think about diversity or think about diverse candidates, they think about it in terms of charity. And it should not be the case, because we have a lot of research that is showing it that if you don't do it, not only you're missing out on a lot of things, but you are also underperforming, but you won't know, because it's just, those are just missed opportunities.
Dorian?
Yeah, I just want to build off of it and talk about one thing that you mentioned. I think we have to change the language around this whole piece around emerging fund managers, right?
Yeah.
Habib, you are an emerging fund manager if you've been investing for 20 plus years in the field. So I would make the argument that we say it's not about teaching us how to fish. We already know how to fish. And we've been fishing well, perhaps not with a pole or the same pole that everybody else has. And so I think we have to name that. And I think when we talk about that language around emerging managers, it's language that means that you're going to, or when I go into those conversations, it's language that means that you're immediately going to continue to undercapitalize us despite what we come into, right? Although it might be your first fund, it doesn't mean that you haven't invested X over such amount of time. It's not your first rodeo. What I would say on the philanthropic side, and just kind of putting my philanthropy hat on, philanthropy is really interesting. I think when one of the things that I immediately realized is that we have to look at how we define value, and really thinking about who we invest in. So, I found that we were really good on the philanthropic side on investing in people who told the worst stories the best about communities, right? And I'll say that again, people that told the worst stories the best. And I think we have to look at the assets and communities in a much different way. Philanthropy is good, and it is necessary, but it is far from sufficient when you're actually talking about real social change, right? You look at those investments, and what I mean by that, for example, we would invest in a school, maybe spend $5 or $10 million in an investment of a school and school programs. In the next 3 or 4 days, speculators would start to buy the houses across the street, right? And so I think you can't look at your equity investments or the capital that you have in your endowment separate than you look at the mission or alignment that you have in your philanthropy. You have to think about total value or total portfolio management and the value that you're hoping to create as a whole, and bring all of those tools to bear to actually be able to do it. If we were going to, one of the things that we started to do is, when we made a programmatic grant, we also provided capital for individuals to be able to buy the buildings that they were in. All right. So it's the opportunity to be able to say, can you thrive in place? Can we think about improvement of communities specifically without displacing residents? And I think we can, but we can't do it in a way that if we continue to undercapitalize, and we will undercapitalize if we only use philanthropy. Last thing I'll say there is, when you look at a place like the Gates Foundation, for example, Gates is probably one of the biggest education investors with probably put over $400 million a year on the ground. If you take one school system, let's say the Houston Independent School District has over a $2.9 billion organization. Philanthropy is very, very small. So that $400 million that they spend might seem like a lot, and they're doing some great things, but what would they be able to do if they actually brought their whole endowment to bear in that? And I think that those are things that they're thinking about and things that they're working on. But that's how we have to look at it. You can't look at one separate from the other. And you have to make sure your mission aligns, like trying to do environment on the philanthropic side, but your whole endowment is invested in fracking, right? Like, it doesn't work.
This has been a really good discussion. We could go on, but I do want to make sure that we're reserving time for the question and answer. So why don't we move on to that? I think we have a question about, can anyone speak to people of color owned investment projects, endowments and foundations that, that can be supported? So there's actually quite a few resources. I think that the Emerging Manager Monthly, notwithstanding the things we've already said about the term emerging, but they're now offering, I think, a free list of emerging, including diverse owned managers in the public markets. I think that we're starting to have more information sharing. There's various groups which we can provide after this panel on the private side for groups that, and Kunle may know some of these resources as well, to access for, like there's the National Association of Investment Companies, I think that has a list, and others that to be able to access diverse owned or led managers as well. And we can provide that in the chat. There's another question. Okay, it looks like we're actually out of time, unfortunately. Apologies again for the late start, but hopefully this has been informative and helpful. I know that shortly after this, there is a final discussion in the main room for the summit. And so we look forward to continuing this discussion and engaging in a productive way.